Rhonda Smith was a 21-year-old from Coweta County, Georgia. She was known for her striking height and came in at 6 feet tall, earning her the nickname Legs. In 1983, she worked for a time as a dancer, a job she kept hidden from her family. But by early 1984, she had quit dancing and was preparing to start her own dog grooming and breeding business. Engaged to be married and looking forward to a bright future, Rhonda was focused on building this new chapter of her life. On February 27, 1984, Rhonda left home around dawn to meet a friend for a shopping trip to Atlanta's Lenox Square Mall. She borrowed a blue 1981 Chevrolet pickup truck for the drive. Rhonda never arrived to meet her friend, and she didn't return home that evening. Alarmed by her absence, her family reported her missing that same day. Not long after, a grim discovery was made in the Lenox Square parking deck. The borrowed pickup truck was found abandoned there with no sign of Rhonda. The vehicle was locked and the keys were missing, but otherwise it appeared undisturbed. Inside, investigators noted two curious items: an empty wine glass and a beer can on the front console. It appeared to investigators that Rhonda may have met someone and shared a drink in the truck, but I'll come back to this in a moment. There were no visible signs of a struggle in or around the vehicle, and nothing obvious to indicate what had happened to its missing driver. Crucially, police at the time didn't collect the drinking containers for forensic analysis, and any potential fingerprints went uncollected. Further, any DNA evidence which was contained on the containers wouldn't have been useful in '84, but may have yielded results by the '90s. As such, it's unknown if she even drank either of the drinks, or if these items had just been left in the truck she borrowed. This abandoned truck and its contents were the only clues, and they deepened the mystery of Rhonda's disappearance. With scant evidence and no witnesses, the investigation into Rhonda Smith's disappearance faced an uphill battle from the start. Her fiancé promptly filed missing person reports in both jurisdictions to ensure no time was lost. Both the Atlanta police and her home county's sheriff's office opened cases, since she lived in one county but vanished in another. Detectives interviewed her fiancé, family, and friends, trying to piece together her last known movements. Nothing indicated that Rhonda had planned to run away. She had left behind all her personal belongings and had upcoming plans, suggesting she fully intended to return home. Foul play was strongly suspected, but investigators had little to go on beyond the truck in the mall garage. No one reported seeing an abduction or confrontation at Lenox Square that day, and any person who might have been with Rhonda remained unidentified. In the days and months following her disappearance, Rhonda's loved ones conducted their own searches and handed out flyers, refusing to let the case fade. However, despite this, over time, the case went cold, and decades passed without answers. For many years, Rhonda's story received relatively little public attention. In fact, her information wasn't even entered into the National Name Us Missing Persons database until 2018, 11 years after the service was launched. One aspect of Rhonda's background that investigators examined was her previous work as a dancer. She had performed at the Tattletale Lounge, a rock and roll themed club in Atlanta, for several months prior to quitting that job. It's unknown if this had anything to do with her disappearance, but police had to consider the possibility. This line of work could have introduced Rhonda to a variety of people, including potentially dangerous individuals, so detectives looked into acquaintances and patrons from the club. That said, there was no clear evidence linking anyone from her dancing days to the case, and no indication that Rhonda was in any kind of trouble because of that job. Over the years, several theories have emerged to explain what might have happened to Rhonda Smith. One theory is that she was the victim of a stranger abduction at the mall. Under this scenario, Rhonda could have been approached by someone in the Lenox Square parking area and then lured or forced away from her truck before anyone noticed. The presence of 2 drinks suggested to the cops that she met someone there. However, they never actually preserved the evidence. There's a very real possibility that she consumed both drinks or had nothing to do with any of the drinks at all, given that the truck was borrowed. A further angle considers whether Rhonda's past at the nightclub might have led to her encountering a dangerous individual who later harmed her. Perhaps a patron or someone from that environment developed an obsession and followed her on the day she disappeared. Under this theory, the individual may have abducted her when she rebuked his advances. Others have suggested that she may have been abducted by a trafficker who wanted to force her to continue to work in the industry. These theories, however, are purely speculative at present. Still, another theory suggests that she wanted to escape the life she was living and decided to leave on her own terms. Again, no evidence has been found to support this, and there's been no familial contact for over 4 decades, casting major doubt on this theory. Tara Grinstead was a 30-year-old high school history teacher and former beauty queen living in the small town of Ocilla, Georgia. She taught 11th grade history at Irwin County High School and was known for her vibrant personality and dedication to her students. During her college years, Tara had been active in pageants, and she won a local Miss Tifton title and even competed for Miss Georgia, using scholarship winnings to help pay for school. By 2005, she was a beloved figure in Ocilla's community and served as a mentor for young women on a similar life path that she had taken. Unfortunately, this beloved local teacher's life was about to be cut tragically short. On Saturday, October 22nd, 2005, Tara spent the day involved in the beauty pageant world she loved. She helped a friend prepare contestants for the local Miss Sweet Potato pageant and attended the event that evening as a coach and supporter. After the pageant, she visited a friend's house and then went to a neighbor's cookout, socializing into the night. Witnesses later recalled that around 11 p.m., Tara was walked to her car by a friend after the cookout, and she then headed home to her nearby house by herself. That weekend, Tara failed to return phone calls, and an acquaintance, a local police captain, reportedly tried to reach her multiple times on Sunday without success. However, it wasn't until Monday that her friends and family realized that something had gone terribly wrong. On the morning of Monday, October 24th, Tara did not show up for work at the high school, and her unexplained absence immediately alarmed her co-workers. Concerned colleagues contacted the authorities to do a welfare check at her home. Police arrived at Tara Grinstead's residence later that day and found an eerie scene. Her car was parked in the driveway, and inside the house they discovered Tara's cell phone and an unlocked door, but there was no sign of Tara herself. Oddly, her purse and keys were missing, suggesting she had left the house with those personal items and had not returned. Investigators noted there were no obvious signs of forced entry into the home, and no indications of a struggle such as broken furniture or blood evidence. The scene was essentially undisturbed, apart from the mystery of Tara's disappearance. Given these suspicious circumstances, local police immediately called upon the Georgia Bureau of Investigation to take the lead. As the GBI took charge, a massive search effort unfolded in Ocilla and the surrounding areas. Law enforcement and volunteers from the community mobilized quickly. They canvassed neighborhoods, distributed flyers, put up billboards, and organized ground searches in hopes of finding any trace of Tara. Despite these efforts, days and then weeks passed with no significant leads. Early on, investigators did recover one potentially crucial piece of evidence just outside Tara's home: a latex glove lying in her yard. Forensic testing revealed the glove bore DNA from an unknown male, raising the strong possibility that Tara had encountered someone the night she went missing. However, this clue led to frustration rather than a quick solution, as the DNA didn't match any of the dozens of men investigators tested. The glove's origin remained a mystery, suggesting the presence of an unidentified man at Tara's house, but giving no further leads to pursue. With physical evidence scarce, the early investigation had to explore every conceivable angle. Detectives conducted interviews with people in Tara's life and checked her phone records and computer for hints. In the absence of quick answers, numerous theories and suspects were scrutinized during those early years. One focus of suspicion was Tara's ex-boyfriend, Marcus Harper, a former Ocilla police officer and Army Ranger. Their long relationship had ended not long before Tara disappeared, and some wondered if a jealous rage or dispute might explain her fate. Harper was thoroughly investigated by authorities and was fully cooperative throughout. He voluntarily provided DNA samples, allowed searches of his vehicle, and fully accounted for his whereabouts on the night in question. His alibi checked out, and his DNA didn't match the glove, leading police to conclude Harper wasn't involved. Another individual examined was Anthony Vickers, a former student of Tara's. Earlier in 2005, Vickers had caused a disturbance outside Tara's home, an incident that resulted in his arrest for disorderly conduct. Given that prior incident, investigators interviewed him regarding the disappearance, but they found no evidence tying Vickers to it and didn't consider him a suspect in Tara's case. With those close to Tara seemingly cleared, some theories speculated that she might have fallen victim to a stranger abduction or a crime of opportunity. After over a decade of frustration, a major break in the case finally arrived in 2017. The catalyst was an unexpected tip, preceded by a resurgence of public interest. In 2016, a podcast called Up and Vanished devoted its first season to Tara's disappearance, bringing new attention to the long-dormant mystery. Not long after the podcast aired, a young woman came forward to the GBI with crucial information. This woman, Brooke Sheridan, was the girlfriend of Bo Dukes, a former friend and classmate of a man named Ryan Duke. Both men had been students at Irwin County High when Tara taught there years before. She told investigators that, after the increased publicity on the case brought on by the podcast, Bo Dukes had confessed to her that he knew what happened to Tara. Acting on this tip, authorities re-interviewed those involved and soon made a stunning announcement. On February 23, 2017, they arrested Ryan Duke and charged him with the slaying of Tara Grinstead. Days later, Bo Dukes was also arrested, accused of helping conceal the crime and tampering with evidence. According to GBI investigators, Ryan Duke, who was 21 at the time of the crime, had allegedly broken into Tara's house in the late hours of October 22, 2005. They believe Tara caught him in the act, leading Duke to fatally attack her. After slaying her, Duke reportedly removed her body from the home. It was then, investigators say, that he enlisted the help of his friend Bo Dukes to dispose of the remains. Dukes, whose family owned a large farm in a neighboring county, later admitted that he assisted Ryan in hiding Tara's body. The two men allegedly took Tara's remains to a remote corner of the Dukes family orchard and burned them to destroy evidence of the crime. This chilling revelation explained why exhaustive searches had never found Tara's body. Investigators even conducted a multi-day excavation of the orchard land in 2017 after the arrests, but they turned up no identifiable remains. The arrests of Ryan Duke and Bo Dukes, nearly 12 years after Tara Grinstead vanished, marked an extraordinary breakthrough. At long last, law enforcement announced that the mystery of Tara's disappearance had been solved, pending final confirmation in court. Now, with both suspects in custody, the focus turned to the legal system to deliver justice for Tara, and you're never going to believe what happened next. In the years following the 2017 arrests, the cases against the two men moved through the courts separately. Bo Dukes was the first to face trial. In March 2019, a jury convicted Dukes on charges related to covering up Tara's death. He was sentenced to the maximum of 25 years in prison for these offenses. Disturbingly, it was also revealed that he was a serial predator, committing multiple essay offenses against women in the intervening years. Ryan Duke, the alleged perpetrator himself, went to trial 3 years later in May 2022. The courtroom proceedings were dramatic. Although Ryan had initially confessed to the GBI, he recanted that confession and claimed it was actually Bo Dukes who was responsible. He now asserted that he had only helped destroy the evidence of the crime out of fear of Dukes. After a closely watched trial nearly 17 years after the crime, the jury delivered a split verdict. Ryan Duke was acquitted of Tara's slaying, as well as related charges of burglary and aggravated assault. This means the jury wasn't convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that he was the one who had ended her. However, the jury did find him guilty of the charge of concealing a death, reflecting his admitted involvement in the cover-up. A judge subsequently sentenced Ryan Duke to 10 years in prison for concealing Tara's death, the maximum penalty for that crime. For over half a century, Buford Pusser's story stood as a classic American tale of one man's war on crime and a family's tragic sacrifice. The rural Tennessee road where his wife was slain in an alleged ambush became a symbol of both heroism and heartbreak. Hollywood turned his tale into the iconic movie Walking Tall, not once but twice, cementing Buford's legacy as a tough, no-nonsense sheriff who wouldn't back down. But in a shocking turn of events, nearly 6 decades later, investigators now say this folk hero lawman was likely the one who pulled the trigger the night his wife perished. Buford Pusser wasn't a typical small-town sheriff. Standing 6 feet 6 inches tall and built like the wrestler he once was, he cut an imposing figure from the moment he took office in McNairy County, Tennessee, in 1964. At just 27 years old, the youngest sheriff in Tennessee's history, he wasted no time cleaning up his county. He quickly earned a reputation for cracking down on moonshine, gambling parlors, and other vices along the Mississippi-Tennessee state line. According to the official narrative, he waged what locals called a one-man war on vice. By one count, he shut down 87 illegal whiskey stills in a single year, directly striking at the profits of local crime syndicates. Groups like the State Line Mob and the Dixie Mafia soon learned that the towering young sheriff would not go easy on them. In the span of a few years, Buford survived over a dozen attempts on his life. Nothing, it seemed, could sway this determined lawman from walking tall in the face of danger. In the pre-dawn hours of August 12, 1967, tragedy struck Buford's family and transformed his legend. According to the account Buford gave at the time, he received a call about a disturbance on a rural road. Despite the early hour, his wife Pauline insisted on accompanying him on the response. As their car passed a church, a second vehicle suddenly roared up alongside them and opened fire into the lawman's car. A storm of lead sprayed through the windshield and windows. Pauline was hit in the head and perished, while Big Buford himself was struck in the face, shattering his jaw. Bleeding and in shock, the sheriff managed to drive away from the attackers before crashing. When help arrived, Pauline was beyond saving, and Buford was barely clinging to life. He spent 18 days in the hospital and underwent multiple surgeries to reconstruct his damaged face. The community was horrified by the brazen attack, and by the official telling, it was a very direct attempt on the life of the sheriff by the very criminals he'd been tirelessly fighting. Buford's version of the ambush quickly became the official story. Even as he recuperated from his wounds, the grieving sheriff vowed to hunt down the people responsible for Pauline's slaying and bring them to justice. He told investigators that he recognized at least some of the assailants. In particular, Buford named a notorious Dixie Mafia figure, Kirksey Nix, as the likely mastermind behind the attack. Though no arrests were ever made, the narrative was clear. Buford's relentless war on organized crime had provoked vicious enemies to strike back at him in the most personal way. The case was effectively closed in 1967, built largely on Buford Pusser's own statement of events and his reputation as an incorruptible officer. In the public eye, Big Bad Buford emerged not only as a fearless crime fighter, but now also as a tragic hero who had paid a terrible price for his bravery. After Pauline's funeral, Buford returned to duty scarred but undeterred, with a new personal mission: to avenge his wife's passing, even if it meant using extrajudicial means. In the years that followed, he reportedly pursued the matter on his own terms. Officially, the investigation into the ambush went cold for lack of evidence, but stories swirled that might have taken justice into his own hands. One by one, several of the men he accused of involvement in the ambush met violent ends. In 1969, an accused Dixie Mob hitman named Carl White was brutally eliminated, and rumors quickly swirled that Buford had secretly arranged the event. Within a year, two more suspects, George McGann and Gary McDaniel, were also found deceased under mysterious circumstances in Texas. Though never proven, many locals believed that these deaths were no coincidence, and that Sheriff Pusser had orchestrated a fierce private vendetta to eliminate anyone involved in the event. Buford himself never admitted any such vigilantism, but he notably never dispelled the rumors either. In the absence of official convictions, the legend took hold that Buford had delivered his own form of justice from the shadows. Whether or not Buford directly ordered any reprisals, the effect was the same. His already formidable reputation grew to near mythic proportions. Here was a lawman who not only survived, but might have personally seen to it that those responsible paid the ultimate price. On the national stage, Buford's heroism was sealed by Hollywood. The 1973 film Walking Tall, loosely based on his life, turned Buford into a household name, and that film is of course why many of you knew who I was talking about immediately. Actor Joe Don Baker portrayed a character modeled on Buford, a towering club-wielding sheriff determined to uproot organized crime in his town. Walking Tall became a hit and an enduring cult classic, spawning two sequels in the 1970s and a remake decades later, featuring The Rock, of all people, as a version of Buford. Notably, Buford had just signed a deal to play himself in a Walking Tall sequel when, in 1974, he passed away in a fiery single-car accident at age 36. His sudden death fueled yet another layer of mystique, with some of his loved ones suspecting that his old enemies had sabotaged his Corvette in revenge. By the mid-1970s, the legend of Buford Pusser seemed complete. He was remembered as the valiant sheriff who walked tall, cleaned up his town, and sacrificed more than most men ever would or could. He was a Wyatt Earp for the mid-20th century, a lawman who wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty to pursue his own form of justice. For decades, nobody seriously questioned the story of Pauline's passing, and this event achieved folkloric status in Tennessee. But as time passed, whispers and doubts endured beneath the surface. In 2022, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation quietly decided to take a fresh look at the case as part of a routine cold case review. In January 2024, The TBI even publicized that Pauline's investigation was still active and asked the public for any new information or tips. One crucial discovery was that no autopsy had ever been performed on Pauline back in 1967, a startling oversight that investigators promptly set out to correct. With her family's consent, Pauline's body was exhumed in February 2024 so that a modern forensic examination could finally be conducted. Agents also received a tip about a potential weapon that had been overlooked, providing a fresh lead that investigators pursued as they re-examined the physical evidence. What they discovered would upend the traditional narrative, at least according to the district attorney. In August 2025, Tennessee authorities announced that new evidence implicated none other than Buford himself in the slaying of his wife. After the 3-year investigation, the local district attorney declared that if Buford were alive today, there was enough proof to present an indictment against him. This bombshell finding suggested that the infamous ambush was an elaborate cover-up staged by Buford to conceal his own act of violence. The reopened case uncovered several major inconsistencies in Buford's 1967 account. Modern forensic analysis, aided by the exhumation of Pauline's body, painted a very different picture of the crime scene from the one Buford had described. Notably, Pauline was most likely shot outside of the car, not inside it as the sheriff had long claimed. Her body, investigators believe, was then placed in the car afterward to stage the appearance of a drive-by ambush. Photographs from 1967 showed blood spatter on the car's hood and on the ground that didn't line up with the story of an unknown attacker firing into the vehicle. Even more damning, the wound that Buford sustained to his face appeared to likely be a close contact shot. In short, the forensic evidence pointed to the conclusion that Buford shot his wife at close range and then took drastic steps to make the ambush story more believable. Digging into the couple's history also revealed disturbing context that had been glossed over in the hero narrative. Investigators found signs that Pauline had been a victim of violence before her slaying. Indeed, the new autopsy revealed that she had sustained a broken nose sometime prior to the attack, an injury that had healed by the time of her passing. This finding potentially corroborated long-standing whispers that Pauline's marriage had been troubled, though the exact cause of the break couldn't be confirmed. Law enforcement officials in 2025 were mindful of how shocking this revelation would be to those who grew up idolizing Buford Pusser. At a press conference announcing the findings, the district attorney even acknowledged that many officers had chosen careers in policing because of the walking tall legend. However, he emphasized that the priority was giving dignity to Pauline's family and ensuring that the truth was not buried by time. The TBI, for its part, has pledged transparency and claims they will release the entire cold case file to the public to prove their point. Personally, this is one of those cases where I'm not sure this sort of action would have been taken if Buford was alive. The problem is that if they did get it right, they did so with the evidence in the cold case file, and that means that the initial investigation was so badly botched as to be unreliable. If none of the basic forensic evidence lines up with Buford's contemporary story, then it makes me question whether there was something much bigger going on here. Further, proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt would be incredibly difficult given those initial screw-ups. Personally, I think on a balance of probabilities, the civil standard of proof, Buford would potentially be judged responsible for his wife's passing. The exhumation of Pauline's body revealed forensic inconsistencies with his 1967 ambush account. Blood patterns, bullet trajectories, and the apparent staging of her body all suggest she was shot outside the vehicle rather than inside during a drive-by. His own facial wound, once thought to be a graze from an attacker, aligns more with a close contact shot inflicted at short range, at least if the forensics are accepted. Notably, since Buford isn't alive to defend himself, he can't go and hire a countervailing expert to potentially give an entirely different take. When weighed collectively, these findings, if accepted as true, tip the scale toward a conclusion that Buford orchestrated the scene. In civil proceedings, where jurors or a judge need only be convinced that something is more likely than not, such physical evidence and his history of violence would probably secure liability. However, proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, the criminal standard, would be far more difficult. Nearly 6 decades have passed, and many witnesses are deceased. No weapon was conclusively tied to him, and no eyewitness exists to directly contradict his original story. Reasonable doubt could be raised by the possibility of flawed or degraded forensic evidence, and the alternative suspects named at the time. While persuasive, the case remains circumstantial, making a criminal conviction much less than certain. Therefore, if he was alive, he may have ended up in a situation like O.J. Simpson, who was acquitted criminally but found liable in civil court. Also, full disclosure, I saw Walking Tall when I was a kid, and up until this time had fully bought into the mythos of Buford as a badass American lawman. On February 14, 1975, a couple driving through rural Plaquemines Parish in Louisiana noticed something hanging amidst the trees. Stopping to investigate, they stumbled upon a tragic scene that would briefly capture national attention. At the base of the tree, they found a glass jar containing a handwritten note addressed to Mom and Dad. The boy carried no identification, and authorities would soon refer to him simply as the Plaquemines Parish John Doe. Investigators recovered the note from the jar and discovered it was a lengthy, introspective message from the boy explaining his decision. He wrote that he felt he had never truly developed into a real person, and that he was living in a false, empty existence he could no longer tolerate. The tone was one of profound despair and detachment. He described having a, quote, pervasive melancholy since birth, and believed he had stopped growing emotionally long ago. In the letter, the young man thanked his parents for all the advantages and support they had given him, but implored them not to blame themselves for what he was about to do. He even urged them to consult a psychiatrist to understand his mindset, suggesting there were aspects of his identity or mental state that he himself struggled to accept. Unusually, the note also included a section addressed to the police, and the boy pleaded with authorities not to pursue his identity. He argued that any investigation would accomplish little except to shatter his parents' peace by confirming their worst fears. In a final wish, he asked to be cremated and buried as a John Doe, so his parents could retain hope that their missing son might one day return instead of knowing he was gone forever. Essentially, this teenager tried to erase his own identity to spare his loved one's pain. The content of the note fascinated the public and investigators alike. It was extremely articulate and philosophical, far beyond what one might expect from someone who may have still been in high school. He even referenced the work of sociologist Emile Durkheim on the subject of the act he was doing, indicating he had studied some intellectual perspectives on his situation. Despite the boy's plea for anonymity, authorities couldn't simply close the case. The Plaquemines Parish Sheriff's Office launched an effort to identify the victim, distributing his physical description and fingerprints nationwide in hopes of matching a missing person. The Associated Press picked up the story of this mystery teen, and newspapers around the country ran articles about the unknown youth with the poignant note. Tips and leads began to flow in, as families of missing sons wondered if this could be their child. Over 300 families contacted law enforcement, and many traveled to Louisiana to view the body at a New Orleans area funeral home. Despite this extensive effort, in the end, every lead and comparison turned up empty. By June 1975, with no identification uncovered, authorities felt they had done all they could. The unknown boy was laid to rest in an unmarked grave at a cemetery in Gretna, Louisiana. His funeral was simple and anonymous, in keeping with his own wishes. After the burial, this John Doe case quickly slipped from the spotlight, becoming yet another unsolved mystery. With no actual crime to investigate, there was little incentive for officials to pursue it further. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina's devastation reportedly destroyed many local records, and the John Doe's case file and the exact location of his burial were lost. In 2022, despite the lost case file, he was finally added to the Name Us database, a repository of John and Jane Doe cases as well as missing people. With his case now on the radar, there remains hope that modern forensic techniques might provide answers eventually. However, without a known DNA sample or an exhumation, identifying him will be challenging. While it's known that he was buried in Gretna, the unfortunate reality is that no one knows exactly where he was laid to rest. While he had requested to be cremated in his note, contemporary reports indicate that this wasn't done. His remains do lay somewhere in that cemetery, though, and if someone is able to remember where he was buried, there is the potential to resolve his case once and for all. Many theories have been proposed to explain who this young man was and why he felt compelled to do what he did. Most believe that he suffered from serious depression or another mental illness that left him feeling numb and isolated. He described himself as living a detached, hollow life without real friendships. Some have speculated that this aligns with severe depression or perhaps even high-functioning autism. Another theory is that he was grappling with issues of identity. Being gay had only been removed from the psychiatric list of disorders a year earlier, in 1974, and prejudice remained extremely strong. It's speculated that he might have been very concerned about the grief this reality would have brought to his parents. His suggestion that his parents see a psychiatrist to understand what was going on with him hints that there was something fundamental about himself that he felt they didn't understand. Another theory suggests that he may have been a first-year university student living far away from home who suffered from a mental break. This could explain why he was quoting Durkheim in his letter, and the upper end of his estimated age range puts him well within the range of being a student. Another theory about who he was centers on the national attention the case received in the wake of his passing. The news articles were very clear that the John Doe really didn't want to be identified. Perhaps his parents were one of the families who came to see his body, and recognizing it was him, didn't identify him to the police. After all, the absolute last thing this young man seems to have wanted was a media circus surrounding himself, given his desire to be buried as a John Doe. Under this theory, his parents quietly made their peace, and fearing the national attention that would be brought by his identification, chose to respect his wishes. And I can see why they may have done this. And after all, identifying him wouldn't have brought him back, and no crime was committed that they needed to get justice for their son. In a tragic irony, the young man achieved his wish to remain a nameless enigma, but paradoxically, this status has since captured the hearts and minds of millions of people. I can relate to that in a huge way, since I had previously very briefly covered his story last year. It was just a very short segment, just about 2 minutes, and I couldn't get his story out of my mind. Every few months since that point, I've gone back and looked to see if there was any breakthroughs in his case. And honestly, I'm gonna keep doing that. Perhaps one day we'll know who he was and why he did what he did, but for now, his story will remain one of the most compelling and heartbreaking John Doe cases I've covered. A frantic phone call and a pried open door led to a chilling discovery. 19-year-old beauty queen Nona Dirksmeyer was found deceased in her apartment after being beaten with the base of a floor lamp. The crime, which took place on December 15, 2005, shocked the small town of Russellville, Arkansas. Russellville had rarely seen such brutality, and the loss of a beloved young woman left residents shaken and hungry for justice. In the aftermath, a desperate search for answers unfolded, entangling police, family, and an entire community in a whodunit that remains unsolved to this day. Nona Dirksmeyer was by all accounts a kind and compassionate young woman. By 2005, she was a freshman at Arkansas Tech University and had been a contestant in the Miss Arkansas pageant. She was dating her high school sweetheart, Kevin Jones, and was deeply loved by her family and friends. On December 15, 2005, Nona spent the day on campus taking final exams. That evening, her boyfriend Kevin grew alarmed when she didn't answer her phone, which was highly unusual. He sent a friend to check on her. The friend saw Nona's car outside but got no answer at the door. Fearing something was wrong, Kevin and his mother, Janice, drove to Nona's apartment immediately. They found the front door locked, so Kevin forced open a sliding glass door at the back. Inside, they stumbled onto a nightmare. Nona lay on the floor in a pool of blood, unresponsive. Kevin frantically tried to revive her while Janice called 911, but it was too late. Nona was already gone. The living room was spattered with blood, and a tall floor lamp lay broken nearby. Investigators later determined that the lamp's heavy base was the weapon used to dispatch her. Nona had also been stabbed multiple times around her neck and chest before being bludgeoned, indicating an extremely personal, rage-fueled assault. There were no signs of forced entry and nothing whatsoever to suggest that she had been subjected to an indecent assault. To investigators, this strongly suggested she likely knew her attacker and had let him in willingly. Police naturally looked at Kevin first. He was the one who found Nona, and when officers arrived, they noticed he was covered in her blood. Kevin said it got on him from cradling and trying to revive her, but detectives remained wary. His demeanor also struck them as odd. One officer later noted that Kevin, in shock, reached out as if to shake hands despite having blood on him. This struck the officer as incredibly odd, for a number of reasons. At the station, Kevin underwent hours of questioning and even a polygraph test, which police said he failed. When left alone in the interrogation room, he broke down and at one point slammed a chair in frustration, an outburst investigators interpreted as a sign of a hidden temper. Then a critical piece of evidence turned up, a bloody palm print on the lamp, and it matched Kevin's hand. To the police, this was damning proof that he had handled the weapon during the attack. By this point, detectives had formulated a theory that Nona's slaying was a crime of passion. On the kitchen counter, they found an empty condom wrapper, a clue suggesting Nona might have been with another man. Investigators speculated that Kevin discovered this and, in a jealous fury, confronted Nona. In their scenario, an argument erupted and Kevin brutally assaulted her. The brutality of the scene did seem to fit a sudden outburst of anger. Just 6 days after the attack, the lead detective told Kevin he was no longer the prime suspect, but rather that he was their only suspect. On March 31st, 2006, Kevin was formally arrested and charged with Nona's slaying. By then, investigators had interviewed around 50 people in Nona's life, but nothing they learned shook their focus on Kevin. The case quickly became front-page news, and the slaying of a beauty queen brought intense pressure to solve the crime. Local media coverage and community outrage added momentum to the swift action against Kevin. Kevin, just 20 years old, continued to insist he was innocent, and those close to the couple argued that the police had it wrong. Nevertheless, the case against Kevin moved forward to a jury trial. Kevin's trial took place in 2007, and prosecutors argued he was a jealous boyfriend who snapped, pointing to the bloody handprint and the condom wrapper as evidence. The defense countered that Kevin's palm print got on the lamp when he tried to help Nona, and that there was no direct proof he committed the crime. One point of contention was the state of the blood on the lamp. Police witnesses described it as slightly sticky, which the defense argued meant Kevin's handprint was left when the blood was fresh. Under this theory, it was left there during his panicked attempt to save Nona, not at the time of the attack. With no eyewitnesses or confession, and with Kevin's clean record, the defense maintained that the prosecution's case was built on circumstantial clues and a flawed timeline. The decision in this case probably won't shock you, because the prosecution has to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. After deliberation, the jury agreed there was reasonable doubt, and in July 2007, Kevin was found not guilty and acquitted of all charges. He walked free, his name cleared after 18 months under a cloud of suspicion. Nona's family, however, was crushed by the verdict, convinced that the perpetrator had just escaped justice. For the investigators, the outcome was a major setback. Their primary theory had completely collapsed, and the real perpetrator was still at large. After Kevin's acquittal, authorities appointed a special prosecutor to re-examine Nona's case. In this second investigation, a new suspect emerged: Nona's neighbor, Gary Dunn. It turned out that a crucial piece of evidence, the condom wrapper from Nona's apartment, had been tested for DNA. In early 2008, that DNA was matched to Gary Dunn. Also, as a quick aside, the initial investigators never checked for DNA on the wrapper, and it was Kevin's defense team that had it tested in an effort to get him acquitted. Clearly, that seems like incredibly sloppy police work from investigators who were sure they already had their man. This was a major turning point in the case. Dunn lived in the same complex and had a violent past. In 2002, he was convicted of attacking a female jogger with a tree branch in a park and served several years in prison. He had been out on parole for only a few months at the time of Nona's death. Investigators also learned that Dunn's initial statements were deceptive. He gave a shaky alibi and even showed signs of lying on a polygraph when questioned shortly after the slaying. In 2008, armed with the DNA evidence, prosecutors charged Gary Dunn. The case against Dunn, however, was not a slam dunk. The DNA on the condom wrapper placed him in Nona's apartment, but there was little else to tie him definitively to the crime. Further, there was no evidence that she had been subjected to an indecent assault. Notably, it was Kevin's defense team, not the original police, who uncovered the wrapper DNA match, raising questions about oversights in the initial investigation. At Dunn's trial, prosecutors argued that his history of violence made it likely he attacked Nona, while the defense insisted the evidence was too weak and circumstantial. The first trial in 2009 ended with a hung jury when jurors couldn't agree on a verdict. A second trial in 2010 had the same result: another deadlocked jury. After 2 mistrials, prosecutors decided not to attempt a third trial. Dunn was released, and once again Nona's case had no resolution. Gary Dunn always maintained his innocence and continues to do so until this day. The attack that led to the end of Nona Dirksmeyer remains unsolved at present. Despite 2 men having been tried for her slaying, no one has been convicted, and the question of who ended her still hangs over Russellville. Many who followed the case believe Gary Dunn was the likely culprit, and that he slipped through the cracks of the justice system. This suspicion was reinforced when, in 2018, Dunn was arrested for harassing and attempting to abduct a woman in a parking lot, a crime for which he is now serving prison time. I have some significant doubts that there will ever be justice for Nona. The initial investigators clearly mishandled the evidence and didn't even bother to test the condom wrapper found in the apartment. Any further attempt to prosecute anyone for this crime will likely be limited by these failures of the initial investigators. It's important to remember that the prosecution has to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt, and when there are such glaring holes in the initial investigation, that makes it hard to do. In the summer of 1911, on a warm Saturday night in Atlanta, Georgia, a young woman named Emma Lou Sharp went out to look for her missing mother. 20-year-old Emma Lou was worried as she walked the dark streets, knowing a dangerous menace lurked in the city's black neighborhoods. Sure enough, a tall, broad-shouldered stranger in a wide-brimmed hat appeared out of the darkness. He spoke calmly and told Emma Lou she had nothing to fear. He didn't harm girls like her. Then, in an instant, the man lunged and stabbed her in the back before disappearing into the night. Bleeding and terrified, Emma Lou managed to stagger away and survive. But not far from where she was attacked, her mother, 40-year-old Lena Sharp, lay dead. Her throat cut so deeply that she was nearly beheaded. Atlanta had a serial predator on its hands, one so brutal and elusive that the press would soon dub him the Atlanta Ripper. Atlanta in 1911 was a booming southern city proudly advertising itself as the capital of the New South, and effectively the business capital of the South. Notably, black-owned businesses and colleges catering to black students were growing at a rapid pace. But for most black residents, life was harsh and segregated. Many members of the black community in the city were also recent arrivals from rural regions and were far away from their family and the rest of their social connections. In this fraught atmosphere, crimes against black people often didn't receive meaningful attention from the authorities or media. The first slaying that drew notice occurred on May 28, 1911, when a woman named Belle Walker failed to return home from her job as a cook. Her body was found the next morning near her house, her throat slashed by an unknown assailant. The gruesome slaying got only a brief mention in the city's newspapers. 2 weeks later, on June 15th, another black woman was brutally attacked. 22-year-old Addie Watts was struck in the head with a brick and left in some bushes with her throat cut. This second attack in such a short span set off alarm bells, and a local paper published a story claiming there was a, quote, butcher stalking the streets. The article claimed a, quote, insane criminal might be prowling the city and drew a direct comparison to Jack the Ripper. The idea seemed implausible at the time, but as more victims surfaced, it began to seem more likely. Over the next several weeks, one Saturday night after another brought news of another slain woman. Nearly every victim fit a pattern. Young black or mixed-race women, often in their early 20s, attacked while walking alone at night. Each was found with her throat viciously slashed, and some victims' bodies showed signs of horrific mutilation. By early July 1911, at least 8 women had been slain in this manner. The attack on Emma Lou Sharp and her mother Lena on July 1st, 1911, finally convinced even the skeptics that a serial predator was likely on the loose. Newspapers that had earlier downplayed the crimes now featured them prominently, perhaps in hopes of using lurid stories to sell more papers. Significant pressure on the police mounted as prominent, wealthy white families exerted pressure on them to solve the case. These families weren't necessarily upset about the crime spree, but rather the fact that their black female employees started to leave work early or refused to show up at night. Regardless of this apparent lack of altruism or genuine concern, they were able to pressure the authorities into taking the case very seriously. However, as I'll explain shortly, this pressure may have simply led to the cops attempting to close out the file, so to speak. On July 11, 1911, just 10 days after the Sharp incident, the body of another victim, 25-year-old Sadie Holly, was discovered beside a streetcar line. The local papers weren't even sure how to number this attack. Depending on the source, Sadie was either the 7th, 8th, or 9th victim attributed to the Ripper. What was clear was that the perpetrator was growing bolder, and the city's outrage was growing with each new body that was found. Under tremendous pressure, the police ramped up their efforts. Within a day of Sadie Holly's slaying, they arrested a 27-year-old black laborer named Henry Huff. Huff had reportedly been seen with Sadie on the night of her death, and when picked up he was found wearing bloody clothes and bearing scratch marks on his arms. The arrest was splashed across headlines, and for a moment it seemed the nightmare might be over. However, the case against Huff was weak, and he was held only on suspicion, and investigators admitted they lacked solid evidence tying him to the string of attacks. Soon after Huff's arrest, another suspect was caught. A tip led police to 35-year-old Todd Henderson. Henderson, like Huff, had been seen around the area of one of the slayings. The police brought Emma Lou Sharp to the station to see if she could identify Henderson as the man who attacked her. Emma Lou was startled by Henderson's voice and thought he might be the same man, but she couldn't be absolutely certain. That lingering doubt meant Henderson couldn't be definitively pinned as the perpetrator. Henderson didn't do himself any favors. He made an off-color remark that if he were Jack the Ripper, he would have eliminated his own wife first. The police ended up presenting both Huff and Henderson to a grand jury, essentially hoping the jurors might decide whom to indict for the slaying of Sadie Holly. Throughout August 1911, with Huff and Henderson locked up, the attacks unfortunately continued. In late August, another young woman was found with her throat cut in a rail yard on Atlanta's west side. Then in November 1911, 15-year-old Minnie Wise was discovered slain in an alley in the style of the Atlanta Ripper. These attacks occurred while the two main suspects were behind bars, suggesting that neither Huff nor Henderson was the true Ripper unless a copycat was at play. Both men were eventually released without charge. In early 1912, with the investigation stalling, some authorities floated alternative theories. A Fulton County grand jury concluded that the so-called Atlanta Ripper might be a myth. They speculated that each attack could have been an unrelated act of violence by different men, but many Atlantans doubted this explanation. The consistency in the crimes, the uncanny similarities in how, when, and against whom they were carried out, was hard to dismiss. To the community and many officers, it still looked like the work of a single madman. Leads continued to trickle in, and in April 1912, a man named Charlie Owens was convicted and sentenced to life in prison for one of the attacks attributed to the Ripper. It was never clearly reported which victim's case this was, and the secretive way the trial was handled left observers puzzled. Whatever the truth, Owens's imprisonment didn't halt the attacks that newspapers linked to the Ripper. That summer, police arrested yet another suspect, Lawton Brown. Brown's wife had gone to the police with a disturbing story. She said that on several Saturday nights matching the attack dates, her husband came home late with blood on his clothes. Under interrogation, Brown reportedly confessed to at least one attack and hinted at knowing about the others. It seemed like a breakthrough, but the manner of the confession raised red flags. In court, it came out that detectives had beaten Brown severely to extract his confession. Brown recanted, claiming he was coerced, and he was acquitted in October 1912 when a jury found the case against him unconvincing. Once again, Atlanta was back to square one. By 1913, the panic had begun to subside a little, perhaps out of fatigue and the lower frequency of new attacks, but the mystery was far from solved. In March 1913, the slaying of yet another young black woman, Laura Smith, made the papers, and she was noted as possibly the third victim of the Ripper that year. In early 1914, a chilling development revived all the old fears. Handwritten notes were found pinned to emergency call boxes around the city, warning that the Ripper would start attacking younger black women caught out at night. Soon after, several more women were attacked and slain in familiar fashion, bringing the total toll attributed to the Atlanta Ripper to somewhere around 20 victims in all. And then, as mysteriously as it all began, the attack stopped and never resumed. After 1914, no more slayings were linked to the Ripper's spree. The nightmare that had terrorized Atlanta for 3 or 4 years simply evaporated without any satisfactory conclusion. Over a century has passed, and the Atlanta Ripper case remains unsolved. No single suspect was ever definitively identified as the perpetrator, and no one was convicted for the majority of the attacks. After the attack stopped, the authorities rapidly lost interest in wrapping up the investigation, and the case went cold. Contemporary analysis has strongly considered that the Atlanta Ripper might not have been a lone wolf at all. It's possible that multiple perpetrators used the Ripper's brutal methods as a cover for their crimes. Some have suggested it could have been a group that actually communicated and conspired with one another. Others have suggested that as the hysteria built, copycats could simply employ the widely known methods of the Ripper to provide cover for their crimes. Under this theory, these individuals may have simply used it as a cover to attack those close to them without the usual scrutiny that would bring. Others maintain it truly was one man who vanished from Atlanta by 1915, explaining why the attacks ceased so suddenly. Ultimately, the truth of this case is unlikely to ever be known. It takes less than 5 minutes for a family's world to shatter. To put this in perspective, this is less time than it takes to boil a kettle of water or to give Freebird a listen. In that brief window, a perfect June afternoon can curdle into a nightmare, and a beloved child can step behind a bush and drop off the face of the earth. For the Martin family, that window opened and closed on June 14, 1969, in the vast, beautiful, and unforgiving wilderness of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. What followed was not just the frantic search for a missing boy, but a story of chaos, heartbreak, and an unexpected legacy that would change the science of saving lives forever. This is the story of Dennis Martin, the vanished boy who would capture the nation's attention. For the Martin family of Knoxville, Tennessee, the annual Father's Day weekend camping trip was a cherished tradition. In June 1969, William Martin led the familiar expedition, bringing his 2 sons, 9-year-old Douglas and 6-year-old Dennis, along with his own father, Clyde. For Dennis, who was just 6 days shy of his 7th birthday, this was his first time along on this trip. The first day went as planned, and the family hiked from Cades Cove to Russell Field, camping for the night before continuing their journey on Saturday, June 14th. Their destination was Spence Field, a beautiful highland meadow nestled along the Appalachian Trail, known for its stunning views. There they met up with another family, and the afternoon unfolded in the idyllic way of such outings, with the adults relaxing and the children playing. Sometime after lunch, the boys hatched a plan. In a fit of youthful excitement, they decided to play a prank on the adults by splitting up, hiding in the dense foliage that bordered the meadow, and jumping out to surprise them. William Martin watched with amusement as the children whispered and plotted. Because Dennis was wearing a bright red t-shirt, the older boys worried he'd be too easy to spot, so they sent him off in a different direction to hide by himself. It was a seemingly innocent decision, and in any other moment it would have been a minor and forgotten detail in a children's game. But that red shirt, which should have been a beacon of visibility, would instead become an icon of an impenetrable mystery. At approximately 4:30 that afternoon, the mousetrap was sprung. The older boys leaped from their hiding places with shouts and laughter, but Dennis didn't appear. His father, William, had seen him go behind a bush just moments before, and at first there was no alarm. But as the seconds ticked by, a knot of unease began to form, and time began to move slowly. William would later estimate that 5 minutes passed, and initial concern turned into full-blown panic. He began calling his son's name, his voice cutting through the mountain air, but there was no answer. William immediately began a frantic search, running down the trail for nearly 2 miles, convinced his small son couldn't have gone any farther. The other adults joined in, scouring the nearby woods, but absolutely nothing was found. As dusk began to settle over the mountains, the family's nightmare was compounded by a new, formidable adversary: the weather. A severe thunderstorm rolled in with terrifying speed, unleashing a biblical deluge which caused streams to develop into raging torrents. Temperatures dropped to unseasonable lows, only about a dozen degrees off freezing. The storm was more than just bad luck. It was a catastrophic event that acted as an accomplice to the disappearance. It systematically erased the few clues that might have existed, washing away footprints, obliterating any scent for search dogs, and ensuring the scene was wiped clean. The official search for Dennis Martin began at 5 the next morning, Sunday, June 15th. What started with a crew of 30 National Park Service personnel rapidly escalated into the largest search and rescue operation in the history of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. The numbers were staggering, and within a day, the force grew to 240 people. By Dennis's 7th birthday on June 20th, nearly 800 people were combing the mountainside. The effort peaked on June 21st, with an astonishing 1,400 searchers involved. The call for help had been answered by a diverse and dedicated coalition. There were park rangers, local rescue squads from several states, scout troops, college students, firefighters, and even 40 elite Green Berets from Fort Bragg. The story captivated the nation, with President Richard Nixon reportedly monitoring the situation from the White House. Notably, this massive search effort actually had more in common with a disorganized posse than with what we presently think of when we think of search and rescue. At the time, the National Park Service had no detailed, pre-existing search and rescue doctrines. The prevailing philosophy was called surround and drown, where you just take as big a wave of people and sniffer dogs as possible and deluge the area. This surround and drown approach proved to be a catastrophic mistake. The massive, uncoordinated wave of well-intentioned but largely inexperienced volunteers descended on the area, inadvertently destroying the very evidence they were there to find. Potential footprints were trampled, scents that may have still existed were contaminated, and delicate clues like broken twigs were obliterated. The paradox is disturbing. The immense public desire to help did more to hurt the efforts than anything else. The search was officially scaled back on June 26th, largely abandoned by June 29th, and formally closed on September 14th, 1969. The deluge of men and women had receded, leaving the mountain just as silent as it was the moment Dennis disappeared. In the vacuum left by the failed search, theories began to grow. With no body, no clothing, and no concrete evidence, the disappearance of Dennis Martin became a case on which people projected their wildest fears. The most straightforward and officially accepted theory is that Dennis simply wandered off, became disoriented, and perished from exposure or an accident. The area is known for its incessant winds that can easily drown out a small child's cries. While there's no direct evidence to support this claim, this is the official stance of the authorities. The Great Smoky Mountains are home to a variety of wildlife, including black bears and feral pigs, leading to speculation that Dennis was attacked and carried off. Some reports from the time noted that a drought the previous year had made animals bolder and hungrier than usual. However, wildlife experts and many investigators were skeptical of this theory. A predatory attack on a human by a black bear is exceedingly rare, and an event violent enough to carry away a child would almost certainly have left behind some evidence. Still, this theory hasn't been entirely dismissed and is theoretically possible. From the beginning, Dennis's father, William Martin, believed his son was kidnapped. This theory hinges on a single and deeply problematic piece of testimony. On the afternoon Dennis vanished, a tourist named Harold Key and his family were in the park, miles from Spence Field. They reported hearing a loud scream, and then shortly thereafter, they witnessed a rough-looking man advancing through the woods. For investigators, it was a highly unreliable lead. The sighting occurred around 5 trail miles from the disappearance site, a significant distance for someone to carry a child in a short amount of time through rough terrain. Further, there are no direct trails connecting the two locations, meaning that this man would have had to have taken Dennis through the woods directly. The absolute lack of resolution in the Dennis Martin case created a perfect environment for regional legends to attach themselves to the story. Generally, I don't mention these sort of theories for cases such as this, but here there appears to be a significant amount of people who advocate for this theory. For generations, local folklore has included tales of feral people living in the wilderness. Inevitably, the story of the lost boy became intertwined with these legends, with some speculating he was taken by such a group. Notably, Harold Key's description of an unkempt and shaggy man is cited as evidence by people who believe this theory. More than 50 years later, the fate of Dennis Martin remains one of the Great Smoky Mountains' most profound and enduring mysteries. The forest has kept its secret, and it's virtually impossible that we will ever know for certain what happened in those brief minutes at Spence Field. For now, Dennis Martin's case remains yet another haunting, unsolved national park enigma. On February 2, 1982, law enforcement in Ascension Parish in Louisiana made a grim discovery: the body of a young man floating in the Mississippi River near Darrow. The victim had no identification, and the remains were badly decomposed from days or weeks in the water. The sheriff's office treated the incident as suspicious since no COD was immediately evident. Despite some publicity at the time, no family ever came forward to claim him, and no clues to his identity emerged. An autopsy and forensic exam provided a general profile of the John Doe, while also underscoring the difficulties investigators faced. He was a white male, approximately 18 to 21 years old, and around 5 feet 9 inches tall, weighing about 130 to 140 pounds. He had brown hair, though eye color couldn't be determined at the time due to the condition of the remains. Notably, he had a slight overbite, a chipped front tooth, and several dental fillings. These dental details were documented in case they might later help identify him. The coroner couldn't pinpoint an exact cause, but noted no trauma on his body. No personal items were recovered, and his clothing was generic: a plaid Western-style shirt from Sears, blue jeans, a black belt, and Adidas sneakers. This common attire provided no unique leads. Unfortunately, the advanced decomposition also prevented officials from obtaining usable fingerprints. In 1982, without DNA profiling or centralized databases, the lack of identification evidence left investigators with very little to go on in the investigation. Over the decades, various theories have been proposed about what might have happened to the John Doe. Foul play is one possibility, as the body may have been dumped in the river to conceal a crime. However, this remains speculative since no obvious injuries were found on the remains. It's also possible that the death was accidental, for example, a fall from a boat or a bridge into the river. As years passed, the case was entered into national databases like Name Us, and a number of other men were ruled out. As for his identity, one prominent theory is that he was a hitchhiker from out of state. In the early 1980s, many young people traveled long distances by hitchhiking, and some disappeared far from home. This John Doe potentially fits the pattern of a traveler who died on the road with no one local to report him missing. 43 years later, the case is currently receiving renewed attention thanks to modern forensic tools. In 2025, the Faces Lab at Louisiana State University completed a new digital facial reconstruction of the John Doe, using his skull to reconstruct his face. The image was recently publicized by the sheriff's office in hopes that someone might recognize him after so many years. The sheriff's office asked that people share the image widely, so here I am doing my part. Notably, his profile on the Doe network indicates that his DNA was properly preserved. It's unclear if this DNA profile has been sent for forensic genealogy testing at this time. Notably, this process is still new and resource-intensive, so the spotlight generated by the new forensic facial reconstruction may get the ball rolling on this as well. It was an ordinary summer evening on June 26, 2025. 29-year-old Rachel Dawson, a devoted fiancée and caregiver, told her family she was stepping out for a quick walk near her rural home in Irving, Kentucky. When Rachel didn't return or answer her phone, her worried fiancé, Caleb Thompson, tracked her cell phone to a Red Roof Inn about 30 miles away in Winchester. Thompson and other family members rushed to the motel and alerted authorities, who arrived with sirens blaring. Officers raced inside, bracing for the worst, and inside one of the motel rooms, they found Rachel. The young woman who had been full of life just hours before was now lying unresponsive on the floor. Paramedics and police could do nothing. Rachel Dawson was pronounced dead at the scene. The initial indications pointed to a substance overdose, which baffled her loved ones. Rachel had no history of usage, and was even known to be fearful of illicit substances. Upon further digging, the motel room had been rented by a 44-year-old man named Brian Epperson, who was nowhere to be found when police arrived. Court records later confirmed Epperson had booked that room, and when officers tracked him down, they discovered meth in his truck. Epperson was promptly arrested on drug possession charges, while detectives sent Rachel's body for an autopsy to determine the exact cause of death. From the start, Rachel's family doubted that her death was an accident. They knew she would never voluntarily use meth. They also had no idea who Brian Epperson was, or how she would have crossed paths with him. Epperson, 44, worked as a home improvement contractor in central Kentucky, a job that often put him in contact with new people in their homes. When police apprehended him, they quickly learned that this was not the first time Epperson had been linked to a suspicious death. In fact, Epperson was already facing a charge in a separate but eerily similar case, the overdose death of 32-year-old Kristen Morris in May 2025. Morris was found unresponsive at a rental cabin in Powell County on May 31st, with Epperson present at the scene. Her toxicology report later revealed an astronomically high level of meth in her system, nearly 300 times a typical fatal overdose. Disturbingly, beyond the overdose investigations, Epperson has also been accused of other predatory behavior. In July 2025, he was charged with video voyeurism in an unrelated case after an ex-girlfriend discovered a hidden camera in her bedroom. Police say Epperson had given the woman a digital clock containing a secret recording device, and a search of his phone uncovered illicit footage that he had secretly recorded. This revelation painted a picture of a man with dangerous, obsessive tendencies, someone who was willing to violate others' privacy and safety in deeply invasive ways. As detectives dug into Epperson's background, a chilling pattern began to emerge. In both Rachel's and Morris's deaths, investigators recovered unusual gelatin capsules filled with meth. This method that suggested the victims had been deliberately dosed with lethal quantities of the substance. Perhaps most striking, a review of Epperson's phone and online activity yielded evidence of planning. Investigators discovered that he had recently searched the internet for overdose deaths, and they found an Amazon receipt for the purchase of empty pill capsules. In other words, it appeared Epperson had researched how to fatally overdose someone and had acquired the tools to do it. When questioned, he claimed he did not know the women were dead and did not admit to spiking the capsules. With two cases now linked, authorities also revisited a third mysterious death: the November 2024 overdose of a woman named Hillary Davis in Lexington. Davis had been found dead in a hotel room under similar conditions, and detectives now identified a tie between Davis and Epperson. Although Davis's case had initially been treated as an accidental overdose, it's now part of the broader investigation into Epperson's activities. Police publicly named Brian Epperson as the primary suspect in all three women's deaths and began exploring the possibility that there are even more victims beyond these cases. Winchester police have put out a public call for anyone who has ever interacted with Brian Epperson to come forward with information. Kentucky State Police have similarly urged families of any overdose victims with possible ties to Epperson to contact authorities. The full extent of the alleged crimes of Brian Epperson remain unknown at present. It's also important to remember that Brian Epperson remains innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. On a warm 4th of July night in 1988, two Texas teenagers vanished without a trace. 18-year-old Sally McNelly and 16-year-old Shane Stewart had reunited that holiday evening to watch the fireworks in their hometown of San Angelo, Texas. It was the first time they'd been together in months, and tragically, the last time they would ever be seen alive. By the next morning, Shane's prized Camaro was found abandoned near the lake, keys resting on the dashboard and fast food wrappers littering the front seat. There were no obvious signs of a struggle, and initially some hoped the young couple had simply run off together. But as days turned into weeks, that hopeful notion faded, and 4 months later, in November 1988, hunters made a grim discovery that would set this mystery into motion. The Sally McNelly and Shane Stewart case is built on fragments of facts and long-held suspicions, as well as a surprise twist that wouldn't be revealed until 2017. What is definitively known is that on July 4th, 1988, Sally and Shane spent the evening together at Lake Nasworthy, enjoying the Independence Day festivities. They were former high school sweethearts who had recently reconnected after a brief breakup, and both had only just returned to San Angelo that summer. Sometime around 9 o'clock that evening, they watched the annual fireworks show at the lake, and they likely left the crowded area late that night. In the early hours of July 5th, A park ranger discovered Shane's copper-colored Camaro abandoned near Fisher Lake, another reservoir in the area. The car's presence was puzzling. It was parked in a different section of the park than where the fireworks took place, and Shane's keys were left in plain sight on the dash. Inside, nothing seemed amiss, and there were no obvious signs of foul play. That said, because no crime had knowingly been committed at the time, it's unclear how closely the authorities examined this vehicle. Authorities at first treated the situation as a possible runaway or teenage escapade gone awry, but the families of the teens felt in their gut that something was very wrong. Shane had promised to be home by 11 p.m. on the 4th, and it wasn't like him to disappear. A search was launched when the pair failed to turn up after a couple of days, with friends and family frantically checking any places the teens might have gone. On November 11, 1988, the first breakthrough came in a devastating fashion. Remains later identified as Sally's were found on a remote ranch property off a rural farm road in Tom Green County. 3 days later, on November 14th, searchers discovered skeletal remains of Shane in the same general vicinity. The two were found only a short distance apart, confirming they had met the same fate. The condition of the remains indicated they had been exposed to the elements for quite some time. Any forensic clues that might have lingered had likely been eliminated by West Texas weather and scavengers over those 4 months. Investigators could determine little beyond the cause of death. Both teens had been slain by a shotgun blast, likely on the night they disappeared. As the investigation unfolded, an unsettling picture emerged of the teenagers' lives before their deaths. These allegations involve alleged occult activities and a circle of friends that many in town would later describe as a satanic cult. In the year leading up to the event, both Sally and Shane had become involved with a clandestine group of local youths engaged in bizarre rituals. And I should note here that the existence of this group has been confirmed by the authorities, for what that's worth. Sally's close friends, and even her mother, Pat Wade, recalled that the 18-year-old had been attending strange late-night parties featuring black magic ceremonies. When Sally started dating Shane in late 1987, she introduced him to these new friends and their so-called ritualistic parties. Marshall Stewart, Shane's father, noticed an abrupt change in his son's behavior around that time, claiming the once easygoing teen was now getting into fights and acting out. The influence of this group was clearly negative, and both sets of parents feared the teens were in over their heads. And unlike most of these stories involving the occult, those fears weren't unfounded, since this occult group really sounds more like a local gang with some occult trappings. In March 1988, just a few months before their disappearance, Sally and Shane themselves went to the police with alarming information. Sally contacted a sheriff's deputy, Larry Counts, and reported that members of the cult were involved in serious crimes. She handed over a weapon that, according to her, a cult member had given the couple. The person allegedly told Sally and Shane that the weapon had recently been used in a slaying. Skeptical at first, Deputy Counts checked the serial number and discovered it was indeed stolen property, which lent some credibility to the teen's story. The teens confided to law enforcement that they were trying to extricate themselves from the cult, but they feared retaliation if they were caught betraying the group's secrets. This chilling warning that their lives could be in danger would prove to be eerily prophetic. But at any rate, even with the stolen weapon being turned over, the cops didn't seem to take the case overly seriously. In fact, this led to rumors at the time that there was a cover-up related to the occult group, a theory which leaned fully into the satanic panic memes of the time. This theory essentially suggested that all the institutions in this Texas town had been infiltrated by agents of the devil, a theory that has later been dismissed as mass hysteria. But I'll come back to this peculiar phenomenon shortly, so just hang tight for a moment. Shortly after turning over the weapon, Sally and Shane took steps to distance themselves from the occult group and appear to have initially had some success, at least for a short time. They moved out of the apartment they had briefly shared and actually left San Angelo for a time in the spring of 1988. But by early summer, both teens found themselves drawn back to their hometown. In mid-June 1988, roughly 2 weeks before she went missing, Sally made a distressed phone call to her friend Helen. Sally was frantic in the extreme and claimed someone was trying to eliminate her due to her connections with the group she had been trying to distance herself from. Helen, not fully understanding the gravity of the situation, tried to calm her down and didn't report the incident to Sally's family at the time. With hindsight, this plea for help was another ominous red flag that went unheeded. Piecing together the events of July 4th, 1988, has been critical to understanding what might have happened to Shane and Sally. Thanks to witness accounts, investigators have a general timeline of the couple's last hours. After watching the 9 p.m. fireworks at Lake Nasworthy, the pair left the busy lake area and at some point traveled in Shane's car to a secluded spot by Fisher Lake, a few miles away. Why they went there remains uncertain, though it's been speculated that they may have been using it as a lover's lane of sorts. This theory makes a lot of sense to me since they were just reconnecting and they no longer had a shared private apartment where they could spend some alone time. One eyewitness later came forward to say he saw Sally and Shane near a park at Fisher Lake in the late night hours. This witness, fishing from a boat, noticed a pickup truck approach the couple's parked Camaro. He distinctly heard Sally's voice carrying over the water, telling the truck's occupants that they didn't want to be involved with the group anymore. An argument ensued, but the witness assumed it was just some teens partying or quarreling and paid little attention as he departed the area. That snippet of overheard conversation, if accurate, is incredibly telling. It suggests that the people who met Sally and Shane at the lake that night were likely connected to the very group the teens were trying to escape. Notably, this was the last known sighting of them alive, and by daylight on July 5th, when the Camaro was found abandoned, the teens were nowhere to be found. Marshall Stewart, who never believed the runaway theory in the wake of July 4th, took it upon himself to investigate. He recalled that Shane had been having trouble with a particular individual. This was another teenager from the cult crowd whom Shane didn't get along with. According to Marshall, Shane had once said that if he ever saw this person again, a fight would be inevitable. Now, in the wake of the disappearance, Marshall went to that young man's home to confront him. The teen refused to talk about Shane and Sally, but Marshall noticed something chilling. Scratch marks on the boy's face, as if he'd been in a recent scuffle. It was suspicious to say the least, but with no further evidence, nothing was ever done. Further yet, the authorities were still treating the case as a runaway at the time, and wouldn't have interviewed Shane's scratched-up rival. Also, I note that this individual's name has never been released to the public, and you're going to want to keep this in mind going forward since it may be important. Given the eerie circumstances of the case, a number of theories have been proposed to explain who eliminated Sally and Shane and why. The most prevalent theory, especially at the time, was that their slayings were connected to satanic cult activity. The late 1980s were the height of the satanic panic in America, when fear of cults and ritual crime was rampant. According to the media, teenagers would get together, listen to heavy metal while summoning demons in Dungeons and Dragons, all for the glory of the devil, as was the style at the time. Sally and Shane's story, Teenagers dabbling in devil worship who then mysteriously disappeared fit neatly into that narrative. In 1991, Unsolved Mysteries ran a segment on the case, heavily implying that the couple might have been slain as part of a satanic ritual or cult retribution. This is where I first found out about the case, and where I'm sure most of you who heard about it previous to this segment did as well. The show dramatized the occult angle, suggesting that sinister ceremonies or even a sacrifice could be involved. However, as time passed, investigators began to question whether the slayings were really ritualistic at all. Despite the rumors, no concrete evidence of an actual satanic ceremony or symbols was ever reported at the crime scene. In fact, decades later, law enforcement has stated they don't believe the teens were slain because of a satanic rite. More likely, the cult story provided a dramatic backdrop, but the real motive may have been more mundane. Notably, the so-called cult was also involved in a lucrative side business for Satan. They were pushing the devil's lettuce on the local youth and making a tidy profit doing so. Shane and Sally had recently turned over a weapon to the police and were clearly interested in getting out of this group. Under this theory, the two of them were seen as liabilities who would sink a profitable street pharmaceutical operation and land the ringleaders in the slammer. Another theory that has been floated over the years involves specific suspects within the victim's social circle. As mentioned, Shane had conflict with at least one other teenager who was involved in the occult group. Marshall Stewart's encounter with that individual, noticing scratches on his face, is often cited as a clue that a fight happened around the time of the slayings. Some have speculated that this teen confronted Shane and Sally on July 4th, and things turned violent. Under this theory, while this teenager may have been a social connection from the occult group, he didn't commit the act on the authority of the group. For nearly 3 decades, the mystery of who slew Sally McNelly and Shane Stewart saw little movement, until a shocking break in 2017 injected new hope into the cold case. And trust me, this is going to be one of the weirdest and most disturbing twists I've ever discussed, and suggests the occult group wasn't your typical group of edgy teenagers. In June 2017, a 47-year-old San Angelo man named John Cyrus Gilbreth was pulled over by Tom Green County deputies on a routine stop. This minor incident quickly escalated into something far more significant. Gilbreth's passenger made a remark to officers that he was involved in the street pharmacy game, prompting investigators to obtain a warrant to search his home. What they found instead was a trove of items that appeared to tie Gilbreth directly to the 1988 double slaying. According to police statements and reports from local media, the search of Gilbreth's residence uncovered personal writings and notes explicitly mentioning Shane and Sally. There were also 3 cassette tapes, all of which contained the initials of the couple, though the sound quality was so degraded that it was impossible to determine what was going on. Even more damning, they discovered physical evidence, including hair and fingernails that are believed to have belonged to the deceased pair. The revelation was stunning, and for the first time, authorities publicly named John Gilbreth as a person of interest in the slayings of Sally and Shane. It turned out Gilbreth was not an unknown figure in the case. Investigators acknowledged that he had been on their radar from the very beginning, and he was one of the teenagers involved in the same occult group back in 1988. In other words, Gilbreth was one of Sally and Shane's alleged friends who had a penchant for satanic-themed gatherings. He had a checkered past in the years after the slayings, including a felony theft conviction in 1989 and a substance-related conviction in 1994. Gilbreth was eventually convicted on unrelated charges based upon an arsenal of weaponry that was also incidentally found during the search. As a convicted felon, he was, of course, not allowed to be in possession of these items, and he was sent to federal prison in 2018. Notably, however, he has never been charged with the slayings of Shane and Sally. The evidence found at his home is strongly suggestive, but likely not enough on its own to secure an indictment without corroborating proof or testimony. As of now, the slayings of Sally McNelly and Shane Stewart remain officially unsolved. Cold case detectives and Texas Rangers continue to follow leads, and advancements in forensic technology offer new possibilities. Perhaps the most interesting potential new forensic opportunity will come from those cassette tapes. If new technology improves the ability to restore the tapes, these recordings may contain the truth of what happened to the young couple. My own theory is that while John Gilbreth sits in federal custody, investigators are quietly stacking evidence against him and re-examining items seized in 2017. Given that he's out of the game for the foreseeable future, the authorities have been gifted the ability to build the absolute strongest case possible against him. Prosecutors have strong incentives to wait until the case is airtight. Cold cases can hinge on so many different factors, and an acquittal triggers double jeopardy protections in almost all cases. Of course, it may be that there's simply no evidence that this guy actually did it, and he may have received these disturbing mementos from the person who did. After all, they all hung out in the same spooky cult-like group, so it's very possible that biological material from the victims was distributed amongst the members. Also, personally, I wonder if Gilbreth is the guy that Shane's dad confronted back in the day. If he's not, I would hope that the cops have paid that guy a visit as well. A United States congressman vanishing without a trace sounds like something out of a Netflix series, yet that's exactly what happened to Jeremiah Harrelson. Harrelson, a pioneering African-American politician during the Reconstruction era, survived the horrors of an antebellum plantation to enter Congress. Despite this, we know remarkably little about his last years, and he disappeared without a trace, having become a disgraced public figure. The only thing that's certain is that this man's journey from the very bottom to the halls of Congress to his mystery end make for one of American history's most intriguing unsolved stories. Born in Georgia in 1846, he was sold twice as a child and endured brutal whippings that left his back scarred for life. With no formal schooling available, Harrelson taught himself to read and write as a young man. This self-education, combined with his natural gift for public speaking, propelled him into politics. By 1870, just 5 years after his emancipation, Harrelson won election to the Alabama state legislature as one of the first black lawmakers in the Reconstruction era. 2 years later, he advanced to the state Senate, where he pushed through laws focusing on equality between black and white citizens of the state. Harrelson quickly earned a reputation as a witty, eloquent speaker and an independent thinker. His talents didn't go unnoticed, and Frederick Douglass himself applauded Harrelson for combining keen humor with sound sense in his oratory. In 1874, at just 28 years old, Jeremiah Harrelson set his sights on the United States Congress. He ran for a House seat in one of Alabama's black-majority congressional districts and won with roughly 55% of the vote. Taking office in 1875, he joined the very small group of African Americans then serving in Congress. Harrelson sat on the House Committee on Public Expenditures and introduced bills to support public education and aid his constituents back home. However, the same forces that had propelled him to office also made his tenure precarious. His service deeply angered many ex-Confederates, and they worked incredibly hard, both through legal and illegal means, to ensure Harrelson wouldn't remain in Washington. In the 1876 election, Harrelson's voter base faced a rampant voter intimidation campaign, allowing an ex-Confederate Democrat to take his seat, essentially by force. Due to the suppression campaign against him and his supporters, in early 1877, Harrelson traveled to Washington to testify about voter intimidation tactics. Even after losing office, Harrelson didn't give up on public service, and he later served roles within the Washington bureaucracy. By the early 1890s, he had relocated to Arkansas to serve as a federal pension agent, helping veterans and widows file claims. Unfortunately for Harrelson, this chapter of his life ended in extreme disgrace. In late 1894, Harrelson was arrested on charges of fraud, accused of forging pension paperwork, and swiftly convicted in federal court. A judge sentenced him to 2 years in prison, the maximum penalty, which he served in the Albany County Penitentiary in New York. Newspapers in America and around the world picked up the story of the former congressman who would now be serving hard time for fraud. Harrelson was about 49 years old when he entered prison in 1895, and that's the last time he appears in known historical records. From that point forward, he vanished entirely from newspaper accounts and official documents. After serving his sentence, likely by 1897, Harrelson effectively stepped off the public stage. Once Harrelson dropped out of sight, his final fate became a subject of speculation. Lacking concrete evidence, biographers struggled to determine when or how he perished. The most infamous account of his demise emerged in the 1920s, when a congressional biographical directory reported that Harrelson had moved to Colorado after his release. In this biography, it was claimed that he had been slain by, quote, wild beasts while hunting around 1916. Even Harrelson's portrait in the Library of Congress archives was long captioned with that grisly claim. According to the tale, the former congressman met that brutal end in the Rocky Mountains at age 69 or 70. In the absence of any other information, this lurid story took hold and was repeated for decades as fact. Today, historians generally doubt the wild animal story. Modern research has found no evidence that Harrelson ever relocated to Colorado permanently, and there's no evidence that he ever even traveled there. There's no death certificate, no known grave, and no contemporary news report to verify the account. The wild beast's tale appears to have been based on nothing more than hearsay or mistaken identity. Some have suggested that he may have perished while he was in federal custody, and that the authorities simply never reported it or even covered it up. In support of this theory, proponents have argued that the living standards in American prisons in the late 19th century were abysmal and diseases ran rampant. Further, despite being a disgraced politician, Harrelson still had access to politically powerful friends who may have made life very difficult for those who had custody of him when he perished. However, all that said, this theory is purely speculative and simply relies upon the circumstantial evidence that he was in prison and the prisons were unsanitary. Yet another theory suggests that Harrelson was released and simply left the country afterwards. It's been speculated that he may have quietly moved to Canada or Latin America, where he lived out his life under an assumed identity, escaping the disgrace of his criminal conviction. Supporters of this theory believe that given that he was released from prison in upstate New York, Canada would have been his most likely destination. Despite substantial efforts over the last decades, no new evidence has turned up, and the consensus among experts is that Jeremiah Harrelson's fate remains a mystery. He remains one of the few people to have served in Congress whose fates are entirely unknown to history. The quiet calm of a Texas summer afternoon was shattered on August 2, 1997, when a passerby stumbled upon a gruesome find on the east side of Lake Arlington. There, near the water's edge, lay the decomposed body of an unknown man. Authorities were called, and a baffling mystery began that endures to this day. The victim was a white male, estimated to be between 40 and 55 years old, and around 5'10". Forensic analysis suggested he had been deceased for about 1 to 2 months, likely since June or July of 1997. There were no signs of any acute injuries, and the medical examiner couldn't determine a cause of death from the remains. Found in a relatively remote spot by the lake, this John Doe raised many questions from the start, and his mystery continues on today, nearly 20 years later. The man had medium-length brown hair and was discovered wearing casual summer attire. He was dressed in cut-off Wrangler denim shorts, white Converse sneakers with red trim, and a pair of Ray-Ban sunglasses. Along with his clothing, several personal items were recovered, which could serve to identify who this man is. These included a silver-colored necklace, a lighter, a folding pocket knife, a purple comb, and a gold-toned token emblazoned with a riverboat and the words, "No cash value." Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find any photographs of these items online on Name Us or on any other sources. This is, of course, a bit of an issue since silver-colored necklace doesn't serve to narrow things down very much. At any rate, these belongings painted a rough sketch of his life, at least to those investigators who were able to view them directly. Notably, the token was what has been described as a generic arcade or casino token. Investigators checked its origin, but that went nowhere since such tokens were mass-produced. Personally, though, without seeing the token itself, I'd be wary of any such conclusion, and I suspect there may have been some minor distinctions added that could be a clue. Despite the evidence recovered, nothing found with the body gave away the man's identity. Unfortunately, he carried no wallet, no identification, and no other forms of identifying paperwork. Authorities released a forensic sketch as well, which is quite distinctive, but this too led to nothing. Notably, his fingerprints were taken, but they didn't match any entries in law enforcement databases. Dental records were also compared against missing persons reports, with no success. Years later, a DNA profile was eventually obtained from his remains and uploaded to national databases, but as yet, it returned no matches either. It quickly became clear that this case wasn't about to be cracked with 90s forensic technology, so detectives looked at the context in which he was found. He was on an isolated patch of shoreline littered with empty bottles and trash, and there was evidence it was a local party spot. This environmental clue hinted that he might have been there socializing or camping, but the cops were unable to find any abandoned campsite that might have been his. That said, this isn't necessarily unusual given the post-mortem interval on this case, and any number of factors could have led to his camp being taken down within that interval. Unfortunately, despite police requests, no witnesses ever came forward to say they saw a stranger in the area in the relevant time period. That said, investigators didn't find his body until months later, and of course memories had already begun to fade at that point. With each avenue turning up empty, the case went cold. In the absence of answers, several theories have been put forward about who this man was and how he perished. One theory is that he was a transient or homeless drifter who lived off the grid. Perhaps he had no fixed home and moved from place to place, which would explain why no missing person report ever matched him. He might not have had close family in touch, or those who knew him didn't realize he was missing. However, running against the homeless theory is that he wasn't dressed in the layered style that homeless people generally adopt, so they can carry their entire wardrobe with them. Another possibility is that his death was a misadventure or a simple accident. He could have been fishing or drinking by the water and ended up drowning or suffering a fatal fall or medical emergency. The fact that the area appeared to be a party spot supports this idea. He might have been out there with others late at night, and something went wrong. If he was intoxicated or unwell and collapsed, the people with him might have panicked and left him, especially if they were afraid of legal trouble. Notably, under this theory, both the John Doe and the other people involved may have been partaking in less than legitimate pharmaceuticals. An accident in such a secluded area could easily go unreported and undocumented under these circumstances. There is also the theory of foul play, though evidence for this is limited. The remote location raises the question of whether someone could have slain him elsewhere and dumped his body by the lake to avoid detection. However, without obvious trauma on the remains, there's no clear indication of this actually happening. That said, it's possible he was suffocated, something that wouldn't necessarily leave a mark on bones. But again, this is purely speculative. Investigators didn't have enough information to label the case as foul play, so it remains classified as an unexplained event. As of 2025, this John Doe, found on the shores of Lake Arlington, is still unidentified. However, forensic science is advancing rapidly, and there's hope that forensic genetic genealogy can finally crack the mystery of his identity. From there, the cops will theoretically be able to build out the last days, weeks, and months of his life and determine what actually happened to him. In July 1971, two boys walking near Route 99 in Woodstock, Maryland, found a woman clinging to life in a wooded field off a dirt road. She was unconscious, badly sunburned, and had no identification on her whatsoever. Rescuers rushed her to a Baltimore hospital, where doctors performed emergency brain surgery in an attempt to save her life, but she never regained consciousness to tell anyone who she was. She perished about 2 months later, on what would have been her 47th birthday, her name still unknown. The medical examiner determined that a violent blow to her abdomen had caused a fatal stroke, so her death was ruled a slaying. For more than 50 years, the mystery of the Woodstock Jane Doe remained completely unsolved. Police periodically revisited the case, but every effort to identify the woman fell short. Investigators even circulated sketches of her face in newspapers, but nobody recognized her. Finally, in 2024, Howard County investigators turned to advanced forensic technology to crack the case and referred the case to Othram. Othram is a forensic genetic genealogy company that has been on an absolute tear in the last number of years, helping solve cold cases. Genetic genealogy led to an elderly man in Ohio named Charles Sharkey, who turned out to be a very close relative of the mystery woman. In fact, further testing revealed Charles was her son. Armed with this discovery, detectives located another potential relative, Charles's older sister, Mildred Cantwell, living in Illinois. In September 2025, 54 years after the woman's death, authorities announced that the Jane Doe had been identified as Sarah Bell Sharkey. She was a Pennsylvania native who had taken the last name Sharkey after marriage in the 1940s. It was an astonishing twist. The victim not only got her name back, but also had 2 children still alive to learn the truth. Sharkey was the 47-year-old mother of 2 who had vanished from her children's lives in the mid-20th century, only to be found brutally assaulted in Maryland years later. Solving Sarah Sharkey's identity also brought about an unexpected family reunion. As children, Charles and Mildred had been placed in an orphanage and adopted into different families, losing track of each other and of their mother entirely. The siblings had been separated since the early 1950s and hadn't seen one another since childhood. Since they were so young when they were split up, they only had vague memories of one another, and they never knew what happened to their biological mother. In fact, both Charles and Mildred had spent significant portions of their life trying to piece together their own personal history. That all changed when 70 years apart, the brother and sister were put back in touch by the cold case detectives. The two began speaking on the phone nearly every day and planned to meet in person for the first time in nearly 70 years. They expressed relief at finally learning their mother's fate and an overwhelming sense of joy at finding each other again. Charles said he had believed he would never reconnect with his family, and Mildred said knowing the truth about her mother gave her long-awaited peace. But of course, this is a series on unsolved mysteries, and the obvious question remains here. The investigation has now been reopened into the slaying of Sarah Sharkey, and detectives are working to retrace her last known steps. They know she spent most of her life in Pennsylvania, which makes her presence in rural Howard County in Maryland perplexing. One theory is that she may have traveled to Maryland with someone she knew, and that this person turned violent. The fact that her purse was missing hints at a possible robbery or an assailant's attempt to conceal her identity. Investigators have revealed that they believe she was left in that field on purpose, perhaps dumped there after an assault in a different location. No suspects have been publicly named yet, but knowing Sarah's identity gives police new avenues to explore. They are interviewing any remaining friends, acquaintances, and relatives of Sarah to learn about her life in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Unfortunately, as yet, there's been no photograph released of Sarah to indicate what she looked like. However, a forensic drawing has been released, which the authorities hope will jog someone's memory. Anyway, if you think you recognize this woman, please reach out to the Howard County Cold Case Unit since they're looking to talk to anyone with any potential connections to Sharkey. On a calm September night in 1989, at a convenience store along a lonely highway in North Florida, 36-year-old Darlene Messer vanished without a trace. 2 days later, a railroad conductor crossing a small bridge made a horrifying discovery. Darlene's crumpled body lay face down in the shallow water below. Her face had been beaten so savagely that identification was nearly impossible, and it was later determined that Darlene had been abducted from her workplace and brutally eliminated. This is the haunting story of what happened to Darlene Messer and the enduring mystery that continues to this day. Darlene was a 36-year-old mother originally from Calgary in Canada. In 1987, she moved to Florida to be near a prison pen pal, Charles Messer, who would soon become her husband. Charles was imprisoned for slaying an individual during a robbery and was actually scheduled to get the big state-sponsored DP. According to those who knew Darlene, she knew about the nature of his criminal offenses, but she had been led to believe that he was going to get paroled. I'm guessing she didn't know too much about Florida justice, but hey, it was the 80s. By that year, Darlene was living in Lake City and working the overnight shift at a convenience store. Her mother was visiting from Canada at the time, completely unaware of the tragedy about to unfold. Late on September 18, 1989, Darlene was behind the counter on her usual graveyard shift. Shortly after midnight, a couple from Georgia stopped in around 12:35 for coffee and snacks. They stayed for about 15 minutes, and as they left, they nearly collided with an incoming vehicle, an older rust-colored Pontiac Grand Prix. This was the last car seen at the store before everything went wrong. At about 12:55 a.m., minutes after that mystery car arrived, the store's silent alarm went off. Police rushed to the scene and found the place empty and chaotic. Around $100 was missing from the register, and money and goods were strewn across the floor, and Darlene was gone. She was packing a Roscoe in her purse, but it appeared that the weapon was simply too far away from her. This suggested that this was a violent and sudden abduction. A frantic search began for the missing clerk almost immediately, with her mother attempting to help in any way she could. 2 days later, on September 20th, A train conductor passing over a bridge about 13 miles from the store spotted a body in the shallow water below. Authorities found Darlene lying face down in water under the bridge. She was fully clothed but missing one shoe, as well as a necklace and an earring. These are items that were potentially lost in the struggle, or potentially dark souvenirs taken by the predator. She had been beaten, possibly with a hammer, and the blows to her face were so severe she was almost unrecognizable. I don't usually get into the gruesome details, but here it's important since some have suggested that this hints at a personal grudge against Darlene. And keep that in mind, because there were two men who definitely had some serious hatred of her, but I'll get to that in a moment. Evidence on the bridge indicated she was probably eliminated there and her body thrown into the creek afterward. Investigators also noted an oil stain on the bridge, possibly left by the perp's vehicle. Detectives began piecing together leads. The couple who last saw Darlene described the car they encountered, but they couldn't see the driver. 10 days before the slaying, Darlene had reported two suspicious men lurking around the convenience store's parking lot. Police responded and arrested the pair, who were armed. These men, known as Bob and Roger, were former co-workers of Darlene's. She had even reported them for theft at a previous job, suggesting a grudge. When they were arrested, Bob and Roger were driving a rust-colored Grand Prix that leaked oil, eerily similar to the car and clues in Darlene's case. Further, the very personal way in which Darlene was eliminated by the perpetrator or perpetrators does suggest a grudge may have been at play, and Bob and Roger definitely had one. Investigators focused on these two men, and both denied involvement and claimed they were nowhere near Lake City that night. Ultimately, forensic evidence at the scene suggested they weren't solely responsible. That said, the authorities have speculated that they may have had help from another man, explaining why the forensic situation doesn't line up neatly, and they've never been cleared. Another lead pointed to a 31-year-old man arrested in Gainesville for a string of convenience store robberies around that time. A witness had reported seeing a blue car with a woman screaming near Lake City on the night Darlene disappeared, and this suspect drove a blue car. He also had a violent past, and his own wife reportedly made statements implicating him. Police impounded his vehicle, but found nothing to tie him to Darlene's abduction. Given Darlene's unusual personal life, detectives considered her husband as well. Charles Messer was in prison at the time, and some speculated he orchestrated an attack from prison out of jealousy. This theory never gained traction, and police found no evidence for it, and believed Charles had no role in his wife's death. Others have speculated that her connection to Messer may have made her a target. Under this line of reasoning, she may have been targeted by someone who Messer wronged, either in his criminal career or inside prison. Ultimately, however, there's no proof of this, despite how intriguing the theory may be. In the summer of 1996, one man embarked on a frantic journey across North America, convinced he was running for his life. Just days later, he was found deceased in a Tennessee parking lot, surrounded by thousands of dollars in cash and gold that the perpetrator mysteriously left untouched. Authorities were baffled as this man had no known ties to Tennessee, and the way he arrived made as little sense as the way he died. Blair Adams was a 31-year-old construction foreman from Surrey, British Columbia in Canada. By all accounts, he was a hard worker. He had recently returned from a project in Germany and was well regarded in his job at his stepfather's construction company. Adams had battled the bottle in the past, but had been sober for 2 years. In early 1996, however, those close to him noticed alarming changes in his behavior. He abruptly quit his job without even collecting his last paycheck and began exhibiting paranoia and mood swings. He told his mother that people were spreading rumors about him, and told friends that someone was trying to knock him off. By July of 1996, Blair Adams genuinely believed his life was in danger, whether the threat was real or imagined. On Friday, July 5, 1996, Blair Adams took drastic action. He withdrew nearly all the money from his bank account and emptied his safe deposit box of cash, gold, and jewelry. With this small fortune on hand, he abruptly left Canada, convinced he had to escape whoever he feared. That same day, Adams tried to enter the United States by car ferry from Victoria, British Columbia to Seattle. His plan immediately hit a snag. As a lone man carrying a large amount of cash, Adams drew suspicion from U.S. immigration officials who feared he might be doing something illicit. When they discovered his past minor criminal charges for possession of a controlled substance, they denied him entry at the border. Adams was turned back, thwarting his first attempt to flee Canada. Over the next few days, Blair Adams grew only more desperate. On July 8th, he avoided his own apartment and stayed with his mother, refusing to say exactly what was wrong, but remaining convinced someone wanted him dead. That day, he even bought an expensive round-trip plane ticket to Frankfurt, Germany, possibly to visit a girlfriend he had met while working there, only to cancel it later the same day. His erratic planning suggested he couldn't decide where to run. He seemed to be grasping at any escape route. In the early hours of July 9th, Adams tried once more to cross into the U.S., this time on foot via the Pacific Highway border crossing from British Columbia into Washington state. Border agents noticed that Blair had fresh scratches on his hands and legs, and that he oddly matched the description of a man linked to a recently stolen car found nearby. They briefly detained him, suspecting he might be the car thief, but with no hard evidence, they had to let him go. Once again, Blair Adams was back on Canadian soil, but not for long. Determined to get away, Adams quickly devised a new plan. He drove his own car to the Vancouver airport and left it there, renting a Nissan Altima to make another attempt at the border. This third try was successful. Later on July 9th, Adams finally managed to slip into the United States by car and headed to Seattle. Upon arriving at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, his movements became even more puzzling. He abandoned the rental car at the airport and purchased an overnight one-way plane ticket to the nation's capital. It was a costly and illogical choice. Adams paid more, specifically for a one-way ticket, when agents advised him he could get a cheaper round-trip ticket. Why he chose Washington, D.C., and why he didn't simply fly directly somewhere closer to his perceived safe haven remains unclear. Some have speculated that this bizarre pattern of travel was intended to show off the forces that he perceived to be trailing him. What is clear is that early on July 10th, Blair Adams landed at Dulles International Airport and immediately rented a Toyota Camry for a long road trip. After renting the car, Adams set off driving with no one really knowing his ultimate destination. By that evening, July 10th, 1996, he had traveled about 500 miles southwest to East Tennessee. Around 5:30 p.m., Blair Adams turned up at a gas station off Interstate 40 in the Strawberry Plains area just outside Knoxville. Here he encountered yet another bizarre hurdle. Adams told the gas station staff that he couldn't start his car, believing the key wasn't working. A repair service employee responded to the call for help, and he quickly discovered the simple problem. Blair was using the wrong key for the car. Adams had accidentally grabbed the Nissan key from his previous rental and was trying to use it on the Toyota Camry he was now driving. The employee later recalled that Blair appeared completely confused and irrationally insisted that he had the right key even when it clearly didn't fit. Unable to persuade Adams to simply check his pockets for the correct car key, the employee arranged for the Camry to be towed to a repair shop. He then gave Blair Adams a lift to a nearby motel called the Fairfield Inn. It was now about 7 o'clock at night on July 10th, and Adams had nowhere to go until his car could be sorted out the next day. At the Fairfield Inn, Blair's nervous, erratic behavior continued. He paid $100 cash for a room and even left a $50 deposit for the key. But oddly, he walked away without waiting to get his change back. Over the next 40 minutes, surveillance cameras captured him entering and exiting the hotel lobby 5 separate times before finally heading out of the building for good. According to a hotel employee, Adams appeared paranoid and kept looking over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to follow him or show up any moment. He never actually went to the room he'd purchased, and by 7:30 that evening, Blair Adams walked out of the Fairfield Inn's front door for the last time, never to return. What Adams did during the overnight hours of July 10th into July 11th is one of the lingering mysteries of this case. With his car in the shop and his hotel room unused, he was essentially stranded on foot in an unfamiliar city. There were a couple of unconfirmed sightings later that night. Employees at a nearby truck stop claimed they saw a man matching Adams's description around 10 that night. He was reportedly talking to another man about Canadian currency, which strongly bolsters the potential that it was him. 2 women also reported seeing him chatting with an unidentified man outside a Cracker Barrel restaurant adjacent to his motel. These leads never panned out, and the descriptions of the mysterious man varied, so investigators couldn't be sure of anything. It wasn't entirely clear if these sightings were Blair, and it wasn't clear either if he was sighted with the same man each time. Notably, a forensic sketch of the man seen with Blair was produced, but this sketch produced no results. Personally, I think this sketch actually looks a lot like Blair himself, if he was in a fairly bad state, and I've put their pictures up side by side for comparison. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and feel free to tell me I'm totally off base, since I'm awful with face comparisons. What is known is that at some point that night, Adams got a meal from somewhere because an autopsy later found he had eaten lettuce, meat, and shrimp not long before he died. But beyond those scant clues, Blair Adams's movements in his final hours remain uncertain. Early the next morning, on July 11th, 1996, the tragic culmination of Blair's odyssey came to light. At about 7:30 that morning, a pair of construction workers arrived at their job site and stumbled upon a disturbing sight. Initially, they noticed what looked like a man lying on the ground in the parking lot and assumed he might be a homeless person sleeping there. As they got closer, it became clear the man wasn't asleep at all. He was dead, and the scene was anything but ordinary. The lifeless body was indeed Blair Adams, and he was stripped from the waist down. His pants had been pulled off and lay inside out near his body, along with his socks and shoes. One of his shoes was oddly propped beneath his head, almost like a makeshift pillow, as if someone had placed it there while he was dying. Scattered all around Blair Adams' body was a small fortune in cash. The workers and police who soon arrived found roughly $4,000 in American, Canadian, and German cash in the pockets of his jeans. Nearby was an open fanny pack containing small gold bars, gold and platinum coins, jewelry, and various other valuables Adams had been carrying. Astonishingly, it appeared that nothing had been taken. Whatever happened to Blair that night clearly was not a simple robbery. The rental car's missing key, the one Blair had insisted he couldn't find at the gas station, turned up lying on the ground close to his body, as did the key card for his unused hotel room. It was as if someone had dumped out the contents of his pockets after ending his life, yet chose not to steal a thing. Investigators processed the scene and the body, uncovering more grim details, and found that Blair Adams had been viciously attacked. He had sustained numerous cuts, abrasions, and bruises, and one of his hands was deeply gashed and blackened, as if it had been slammed into the pavement during a struggle. Tufts of his hair had been ripped out, indicating a fierce fight for his life. A later autopsy determined that the fatal blow was a violent impact to his abdomen, and his stomach was ruptured, causing internal bleeding and deadly septic shock. Investigators believe this massive abdominal trauma could have been caused by a very hard kick or even being struck by a vehicle's bumper. Blair also suffered a severe wound to his forehead, likely from a blunt instrument such as a crowbar or club. Certain injuries suggested a possible indecent assault, though the police were never able to recover any biological evidence to prove this. The investigation into Blair Adams's slaying turned up bizarre clues but few solid answers. One perplexing piece of evidence was literally in Blair's hand. Clenched in his fist was a single long strand of hair. The hair didn't appear to be Blair's own, strongly raising the possibility that it came from his attacker during the struggle. Unfortunately, aside from that lone hair, no other DNA or forensic evidence was found at the scene that could identify the perpetrator. It's unclear whether this hair was preserved, since it's theoretically possible that this hair may be able to yield a DNA profile when it wasn't able to in 1996 with the forensic technology then. Police scoured the construction site for a weapon, even testing pieces of metal rebar lying around, but nothing could be definitively linked to the crime. The case had no eyewitnesses to the attack itself. The closest thing to a witness was a security guard at a business nearby, who reported hearing a short, sharp scream around 3:30 on the night of the attack. The guard initially thought it sounded like a woman's scream, and simply went about his business without alerting anyone at the time. As detectives dug into Blair Adams' background and movements, they grew increasingly puzzled. Here was a man far from home, with no clear reason to be in Knoxville. He didn't know anyone in the area and had made no contact with friends or family during his journey. Investigators retraced his steps using receipts and tickets found in Blair's duffel bag at the scene, confirming the odd path he took from Canada to Tennessee. They interviewed his friends and family back in Canada, who uniformly said Blair was not involved in anything illegal. In fact, despite Blair's own fear that someone was after him, authorities began to suspect that this threat might have been largely a product of his own mental state. By all indications, Blair Adams was suffering from paranoia and delusions in the weeks before his death. Tragically, despite appearing to suffer from a mental break, he did end up encountering real deadly danger. Without a clear suspect, several theories have emerged about what might have happened to Blair Adams. One theory favored by the authorities revolves around an indecent assault, which escalated into Blair being attacked. Blair was likely in the midst of psychosis at the time, and was processing everything through this delusional framework. It's believed that some miscommunication may have occurred leading to violence. Another theory is that Blair Adams fell victim to a random act of violence. Some have speculated about a robbery attempt gone bad. Maybe Blair fought back fiercely, and the attacker panicked and fled without taking the money. The single scream heard at 3:30 in the morning lends credence to a sudden, swift altercation. That said, like all the other theories of the case, there's simply not enough to prove anything. The story of Blair Adams is as haunting as it is baffling. He left behind a trail of clues, from his frantic cross-country movements to the eerie crime scene littered with cash and gold, yet none of it adds up to a coherent answer. The sheriff's office continues to classify the 1996 attack on Blair Adams as an active cold case, holding out hope that new information might one day provide a breakthrough. Heather Sellers was a 20-year-old woman living with family in Spartanburg, South Carolina. She had some previous troubles with addiction, but according to her family, she had gotten her life together in the previous year. On September 24th, 2002, Heather's grandmother dropped her off for an evening shift at the Waffle House near Highway 9 and Interstate 85. Heather carried an overnight bag, planning to stay at her aunt's house after work. Tragically, she never made it home that night. After finishing work, Heather met up with her ex-fiancé, 22-year-old Jonathan Vick. They had broken off their engagement just 2 weeks earlier, but were still seeing each other despite the breakup. That evening, the two visited two local bars, a place called the Rainbow Lounge and another called Cocktails and Dreams. Those outings were the last confirmed sightings of Heather. She never returned to her aunt's, and she never showed up to collect her last paycheck at the Waffle House. Heather's family realized immediately that something was wrong when she failed to come home or call. Disappearing without a word was completely out of character for her. Heather was in regular touch with her relatives and wouldn't drop out of contact like that. Alarmed, her family reported her missing to the Spartanburg County Sheriff's Office and quickly mobilized to search. They contacted friends, drove along Heather's usual routes, and put up missing person flyers around town. Despite these efforts, the early searches turned up nothing, no clues to what happened at all. From the start, Jonathan Vick became the primary focus of the investigation. He was the last person known to have seen Heather alive, as witnesses had spotted them together on the night she disappeared. Heather and Vick's relationship had been tumultuous, and she had confided to family that Vick was abusive during their time together. Further, their breakup 2 weeks before had been extremely tense, and she advised her family that she was scared. Naturally, detectives questioned Vick right away, and he denied any involvement and claimed he didn't know where Heather went that night. With no physical evidence in the early stages, and no body, police couldn't charge him, but their suspicion remained. Investigators also considered other possibilities. For a time, they looked at a potential connection to another missing woman in the area. One of Heather's co-workers at the Waffle House, 32-year-old Michelle Whitaker, had vanished in August 2002, just a month before Heather. This coincidence raised fears of a serial predator and even speculation that Vick might somehow be involved in both cases. However, in 2008, Whitaker was found alive and well. She had left the state voluntarily and was apparently unaware that people back home thought she was missing. In October 2005, 3 years after Heather vanished, a dramatic turn of events cast new suspicion on Vick. That fall, Jonathan Vick was arrested and charged with an unrelated crime: the 1995 slaying of a local woman named Dana Satterfield. Satterfield, a 27-year-old hairdresser, had been slain in her Roebuck, South Carolina beauty salon. In 2006, Vick was convicted of that slaying and sentenced to life in prison. For Heather's loved ones and the authorities, this revelation was chilling. It confirmed that the man they suspected in her disappearance was undeniably capable of truly evil and heinous acts. Following Vick's conviction, Spartanburg authorities revisited Heather's cold case. In 2006, they discovered an abandoned car that had been registered to Vick, and inside it they found bloodstains and a few strands of long blonde hair. Investigators indicated that this evidence was believed to belong to Heather, though it's unclear from the sources what forensic testing was done at that time. That said, it was the most significant clue yet, potentially suggesting that Heather met with foul play at the hands of Jonathan Vick. Even so, the evidence alone wasn't enough to bring charges. By way of reminder, the prosecution only gets one shot to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense, on the other hand, has to prove absolutely nothing whatsoever. It may be helpful for their case to attempt to push back the evidence of the prosecution, but there are no reverse onuses placed upon the defendant in our legal system. The inherent problem with the bloodstains and a hair strand being found in Vic's vehicle is that she had been his girlfriend. It doesn't take a brilliant defense attorney to see how a plausible, innocent explanation for the presence of these materials could exist. To complicate matters even further, strictly speaking, the only evidence that Heather is deceased is circumstantial. Notably, the authorities thought the same and emphasized that they couldn't move forward without more definitive proof. Today, Jonathan Vick remains the prime suspect in Heather Sellers' disappearance. Nearly all signs point to him, from Heather's troubled history with Vick to the fact he was last with her, and the apparent traces of her blood in his vehicle. Alternative theories have been explored, but they seem less likely, both to the authorities and to casual observers such as myself. Some have wondered if Heather might have simply left town due to her fear of Vic and simply didn't let anyone know, so as to minimize any chance that she'd be tracked down. Theoretically, it's possible that she did this for the protection of the people around her as well, as Vic was capable of extreme violence and had threatened her. She may have been worried that giving anyone her location could make those people targets for reprisals as well. However, this of course is just speculation, and there's no evidence to indicate that this was the case. This narrative is also challenged by the fact that she could have come forward after Vic was convicted, though perhaps she had established a new and separate identity by that point. Another theory revolves around Heather's history of substance use. While she was reported to be clean at the time of her disappearance, witnesses reported believing that she was under the influence on the night in question. This has led some to believe that she may have suffered from an accidental overdose. As of 2025, the disappearance of Heather Sellers is still unsolved. If she's alive, Heather would be 42 years old today, though sadly the consensus is that she almost certainly isn't. 16-year-old Amber Cates from Columbia, Tennessee, planned to spend her spring break visiting relatives in Florida. On April 11, 2004, Amber was dropped off at her mother's house, expecting to leave for the trip that day. Instead, a friend arrived to pick her up, and Amber rode away with him, never to be seen again. By all accounts, Amber was a bright and spirited teenager, but Amber had also begun to test boundaries. She was hanging out with older, questionable friends and is believed to have occasionally indulged in illicit substances. When she vanished that spring day, what initially seemed like a potential runaway case soon turned into something far more troubling. Now, more than 20 years later, Amber's disappearance remains an unsolved mystery that haunts her community and family. In early April 2004, Amber was living with her older half-sister Brenda, who had just become Amber's legal guardian a few days earlier. Brenda was trying to provide stability for Amber after a difficult few years. Their father had died around 1999, and Amber had spent time in foster care and lived in multiple states before returning to Tennessee. That spring, Amber made plans to visit a relative in Panama City, Florida, for a short vacation during spring break. On April 11, 2004, which was Easter Sunday, Brenda dropped Amber off at their mother Trudy's home in Columbia, so Amber could depart from there for her trip. However, Amber never actually left town with any relative. Instead, a 20-year-old man named James Gordon arrived that day to pick her up. Gordon was described as Amber's friend, and possibly her boyfriend at the time. Amber climbed into the car with him, telling family she would be back in 2 days, and the pair drove off. She didn't pack as if she were running away for good. It appeared to be just a quick spring break outing. That was the last time Amber's family ever saw her. When 2 days passed and Amber failed to return or call, her family grew worried. They soon discovered that Amber had never arrived in Florida at all. On April 13th or 14th, 2004, Amber's family filed a missing persons report with local authorities. At first, police considered the possibility that Amber had run away on her own, and based on Amber's history, they assumed she was a runaway. But Amber's family insisted she wouldn't just disappear without contacting anyone. Indeed, as days went by with no word from Amber, signs began to point to something more sinister than a teenage runaway case. Her cell phone showed no activity and her bank account showed no withdrawals, two facts which strongly indicated that she hadn't planned any sort of disappearance. The timeline of Amber's last known movements would soon raise even more red flags. According to what James Gordon told police, he and Amber spent some time together in Colombia on the day she disappeared. Gordon claimed that after he picked Amber up, he later dropped her off with another friend of his that evening. This other friend was 39-year-old Ronald Inzuriaga. It's unclear how well Amber herself knew Inzuriaga. He was a much older man with an extremely serious and violent criminal background. He had been convicted of SA in 1992 and spent several years in prison. What is known is that Amber somehow ended up in Inzuriaga's company after leaving with Gordon. Police immediately tried to locate this man, but ran into dead ends, and ultimately, it took 3 years to track him down. The story Ronald later gave would be the last known trace of Amber. He said that he and Amber went to lunch at a Waffle House on James Campbell Boulevard in Columbia. They then stopped so Amber could buy some hair dye, and finally he dropped her off at a garage that was a local hangout spot for teens. It was at that garage, Inzuriaga claimed, that Amber completely disappeared. Curiously, no witnesses have ever definitively confirmed seeing her at the garage, despite that location being the last place she was reported to be. Over the years, several theories have been proposed by law enforcement, by Amber's family, and by community members to explain what might have happened on that April day in 2004. The earliest credible theory was the idea that she was a runaway. However, given that she never contacted friends and family further at any point in the last 2 decades, and given that her social security number was never used, this is considered unlikely. Another theory that has been discussed is that Amber could have fallen victim to trafficking or some form of exploitation. This idea arose mainly because of Amber's age and the circumstances. She was a 16-year-old girl out with older men, one of whom had an extremely disturbing past. While this theory remains plausible, there's nothing beyond the initial circumstantial evidence to support it. Crucially, despite over 2 decades having passed, there have been no sightings of her whatsoever. By and large, the most credible theory in Amber Cates's disappearance is that she met with foul play at the hands of the individuals she was last seen with. The suspicious sequence of events on April 11th, 2004 raises many questions, and just allow me to very briefly sum up how shady this is. One adult man picks up a troubled 16-year-old girl, then hands her off to another even older adult man, who happens to be on a very bad registry, later that same day. The second man, the dude on the registry hanging around with the troubled 16-year-old girl, claims he simply dropped said girl off, and claims no knowledge beyond that. Oh yeah, and also no one saw her at the popular hangout where she was supposedly dropped off. Literally everything about that detour in Colombia seems suspect. It's also necessary to ask, why was a 16-year-old girl, quote-unquote, friends with a 39-year-old like this guy in the first place? Further, it's been questioned to what extent the two of them even knew each other, with the source that they were friends being James Gordon, another questionable individual. Ronald's background makes it hard not to consider him a prime suspect in whatever befell Amber. To be clear, Neither man has ever been charged in connection with the case, and both have denied wrongdoing.